Hey guys, Brian here. Thanks for checking out part 2 of the RED Komodo dynamic range test. I saw your guys' feedback and comments requesting that I do a follow-up video on part 1, explaining what I see and giving my own commentary on the footage. To be honest, for part 1, I was hoping that you guys could look at the footage and make your own conclusions based off what you see. The price point of the Komodo has brought shooters from all different types of backgrounds, and not necessarily all of them come from a technical background as I do, and that's completely fine. Having extra explanation will just further your understanding of the camera. It's my own personal philosophy that cinematography is a subjective art form. Some people might find the camera only has 10 usable stops for them. Some people might say, oh, well, it's 13 usable for me. So while I may interpret and analyze the footage completely differently, I'd love to keep an open discussion and see how you would use it. So if you guys could like, comment, and subscribe, it would really help this channel out because my feedback directly comes from you guys. So please let me know what you want to see in the future and I'll do my best to incorporate it. So is it 16 stops? No. To be honest, that title is actually poking fun at the B&H posting I saw for the RED Komodo. Under the technical specs, it showed that the dynamic range was 16 stops. So where do I place the usable latitude and dynamic range of the camera? Well, let's look at the footage and get right into it. Alright, so first off, we have our D-log-E curve, which I actually had questions about on actually how to read it, so I'll be going over it pretty quickly. It should be noted that these values, they don't actually mean anything. It doesn't refer to a stop value or anything, it's just simply a pixel readout from Photoshop. But what you need to look at is how the values change and by how much. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean like, oh, this is 2 code values, it means half a stop. No, that's not right. It just means that there is very little response in how the sensor perceives a half a stop when it's plus 6 stops over to 6.5 stops. Whereas you could see a huge range in a half stop difference from our middle gray N to our half stop. That's reflected really in the curve that you can see between our N value to half stop over. There is a significant change in exposure or in perceived exposure value. And you could see kind of the steepness of the line here. So what does that mean for the higher end and the lower end? That means that at a higher overexposure value, let's say maybe N plus 5.5. Actually, let's say N plus 5. That's 5 stops over a middle gray. That the camera stops responding to the difference in tone of the gray patch. And I can demonstrate that in the footage. So let's go to our N plus 5 value. This is our N plus 5 stops over. And again, I sample the middle gray patch right here. So between our N plus 5 and then our N plus 5.5, there shouldn't really be a perceivable difference between our gray patch. And that's actually very true. You could see very little response from the camera between these two. Whereas, let's go back to our N value, to our N plus half, so that's half a stop over. There's a pretty significant change. And that's to be expected because it's reflected in our D-log-E chart right here, and not to mention our graph right here. So that means when you're about 5 to 5.5 stops over, the camera, it starts limiting the sensor to a point where it really can't read out any more information, but it's technically not clipped yet. And then you can see our technical clip point at N plus 7. So when we're 7 stops over our middle gray value, here's 7 stops, it stops responding because the camera does not read any difference in value, even a stop over. So that is our digital clip point, that's our hard clip. That's where no information from the sensor is being read anymore. The camera definitely does not have 16 stops of dynamic range because at N plus 8 stops over, it reads the same exact response as 7 stops over. So already, let's just strike this out. We can strike it out, and on the low end, we'll strike that out as well. So the camera truly has between these values, which is minus 7.5 to plus 7.5. So that's 15 stops, but let's take it down further. Again, our N plus 7 value to N plus 7.5, there's no change in response. That means effectively, this stop is dead. The camera does not read plus 7.5 stops over. And on the low end, it does see a little bit of response, but between our n-7 and n-1/2, it's very, very little. It's pretty insignificant. So right here is kind of the range within the bucket of dynamic range that the Komodo sits in. Let's take it further. Let's take it to the latitude of the camera, and I would like to differentiate between latitude and dynamic range. To me, latitude I define as the usable dynamic range of the camera. And what I mean by usable is what I actually see in the scene and can realistically pull usable information from. So let's unpack that. What does usable information mean? Well, to me, usable information is information that I can pull from the scene where I still see something in the scene that I care about. What can be expected for my underexposure? Let's start from low to high. At n-7, we're reading a pretty low value, and let's pull up n-7 on our chart. n-7. So our middle gray here is n-7. You don't see much. So let's go at n-6.5. You still don't see much. There's very little change in tonal value between this patch of middle gray from n-6.5 to n-7. To me, that's not really usable. So I'm gonna go ahead and strike out n-7.5 because to me, this isn't usable. So now my bucket is slowly shrinking, which is to be expected because, typically your usable latitude is lower than the camera's full dynamic range. And I guess I should define what I see as dynamic range, and at a technical level, dynamic range really is how many shades of gray can the camera see. These are all the different gray patches that I sample, and the camera can't see anything over 7 stops of middle gray. So let's take it again to n-7. Here's our n-7. You don't really see much. Let me see if I could just bring up the shadows. Maybe bring up the gamma just a little, see what I can see. Let's take it all the way. Cool. Let me bring the low range down and pull down the darkest of the darks just to really see. So to me, I say this isn't usable personally because even if I try to extract any sort of information that's 7 stops under my middle gray, it's too noisy to actually use. Now, I say that's a subjective comment because some people might kind of want this look. What if you're shooting a very gritty horror film or using the Komodo as like a pseudo security camera? This kind of grain can be a look that you want to achieve. But for me, it's not quite usable, and I'm just gonna pull it back down. And I'm gonna try to pull it down. And even here, it's not really usable. That's like bringing it down just enough to see. So I'm gonna pull it down even more. And yeah, it's still not usable. You don't even really see any sort of information there that can yield to anything useful. But technically, like I said, the camera does see n-7. But again, that's not usable latitude for me. Let's bring it back to n-6.5. Yeah, that's n-6.5. You see a little bit. So let's see if we could recover anything. Let's kind of bring this up and we'll keep my shadows there. And look, at -6.5, there's actually some sort of information that you can retrieve. So what does this mean when you're in a scene like this? This means in a scene, if you have something that's 6.5 stops under middle gray, for example, I'll say, oh, maybe there's something in this fireplace that's about 6.5 stops under. You might be able to extract something of use in there. Now we see a little bit of detail in this fireplace. This is before and this is after, just bringing up that very low tone. Again, this is an example. I don't actually know if this is 6.5 stops under. You see a little bit of detail. And to me, that's actually pretty usable. So I'm kind of impressed that even 6.5 stops, let me go back to it. You can pull information that's not entirely noisy. You can definitely see there's some detail and some tonality in here. We're -6.5. Let's actually pull up something more useful, which is our face. So let me bring up maybe a little bit of gamma, a little bit of shadow detail. You do see a little bit, and it could make the difference in your scene if you want to see just enough detail to be able to bring that up. So that is with no correction, and that's with some shadow recovery correction. If you're exposing something 6.5 stops under your middle gray, you're not going to see much, but it might just be enough to bring out the texture in those low tones, and that could be, that could make or break your shot. So I'd say even 6.5 stops under, that's pretty usable, and that's pretty impressive. So I'll strike out -7, and I think this is a keeper, and it's actually pretty reflective of the code values that we're seeing, where again, between these tones, you can see a tonal difference between the two. So now let's go back to our highlights, our overexposure. So we'll start at middle N again. Let me kind of clear any changes I did. So here's our neutral value, our N, and let's go to 7 stops over, because we know at 7 stops over, everything clips. And I believe this is +7. Again, you kind of lose all detail here. You kind of lose all detail in the face. And if we want to recover this in highlights, I'd say you can't really do much. You really can't. So what does this mean? So this means that, say you have a scene. Here's our scene. Say you have a window that's 7 stops overexposed, and you try to recover any detail in that window. That means within that 7 stops, you won't really be able to recover anything because the camera's completely clipped at that point. And you can see we're not really getting anything back in the middle gray and in our face. There's not really much you can do. All right, so is 7 stops over usable for me? I'd say no. I'm gonna strike that out. So now my bucket of exposure sits between -6.5 stops to +6.5 stops. So about 13 stops. And that's pretty solid. But again, let's refer back to our D log E chart, and that between +6 and +6.5, there's very little difference in the tonality, which you can also look on the chart. Between +6, 6.5, they're basically the same exact value. So now let's go back to here. +6.5, you see some detail around there. I wouldn't say it's significant to +6. You see just barely any. And let's see if there's anything recoverable in 6.5 stops under. A little bit, and where you see it a little bit is just in the face. Look at Derrick's eyebrow, look at his eye, he kind of, I wouldn't really say that's significant, but where I would say it's significant is actually look at these color patches here. So at +6 stops, you see some color, whereas half a stop over that, all the color kind of disappears. Again, what does this actually mean in real world terms? What this means is that if we have a scene, let's just maybe say, here's our scene. If you have a window that's 6.5 stops over, and you're expecting to see any sort of color detail or any detail at all, you won't see anything because it just gets completely desaturated. Whereas, say your window is 6 stops over now, you see maybe just enough color that it works for your shot. And let me see if I could recover anything off that. Not too much, but you do see a little bit of color tonality there, and that could be enough to make your window usable. So I would say 6.5 stops, not really that usable, so I'm gonna go strike that out. And I think the limit where I would put the sensor is at 6 stops over. And again, this is just my own personal opinion. You might be going for a very, very overexposed or low contrast look, and that's totally fine. I've seen some really creative shots having just completely blown out background that just blooms beautifully with a nice silhouette. And again, you might be working in the 6.5 to 7 stops over range, and that's totally fine. But the context that I'm taking this into is a narrative context where I'm lighting a scene to look nice. Just kind of something standard. Let's go back down to our N value. There's our middle gray. And I am saying that +6 is as high as I would want to take the sensor. And I'll say that -6.5 is as low as I want to take the sensor. So we can walk through each half step value, and I can just kind of quickly go through what I'm seeing, and either if I'm seeing a loss of detail or, or what's kind of recoverable. So here is our n value, n plus half. That still looks great. You can see that my highlight here, it's not clipped yet. And from my reading, this highlight was actually about 3 to 3.5 stops over. But we can just kind of keep walking it through. So n plus half, that's still pretty good, looks great. N plus 1, 2, still looks great, there's still nice face detail. N plus 2, n plus 2.5. So now we see at n plus 3, our lantern is completely clipped. And that's actually to be expected, and that's consistent to what we were talking about before, where you can expect that if something is 6 stops over our middle gray, it will be completely clipped in the highlight range and unrecoverable. And again, that makes sense because now we're 3 stops over our middle gray, and then additionally, this is 3 stops over that middle gray. So total, this is 6 stops over. And that's kind of what we said was the limit of our sensor. 6.5, 6, I'll call it 6. So again, that's not really recoverable when it's 6 stops over. So let's go to 3.5, same deal. Let's start looking at the face 4 stops over. So 4 stops over, we're still seeing pretty good detail on the face. It's not that bad. And let me bring down the highlights, and that's kind of before, and we're still pulling nice information there. So that's completely usable. So 4.5, ooh, it's starting to get a little spicy. So let's pull a little bit down. Yeah, there's still kind of face detail that's a little bit recoverable. You can see that on our waveform, it's starting to flatten out right here. But this isn't too bad. And again, our middle gray is looking pretty good. There's between this and this, there's a pretty decent tonal difference. I'll delete that. So now we'll go 5 stops over our middle gray. Plus 5, it's pretty good. You can still see a little bit of detail in the color. These pastel kind of patches are starting to clip and starting to become desaturated, but that's to be expected when you're 5 stops over. Derrick's face detail still looks pretty nice. There's a nice soft roll off, and I am using the medium highlight roll off LUT. Again, with our highlights, we can see that it's starting to roll off. This is clipped completely in this lantern. It's starting to clip up here, but you do see tonal difference 5 stops over. I can bring it down to there, and yeah, there's still recoverable information. There's still some detail. Now 5.5. This is where I would say, oh well, it's starting to lose a lot of detail. And Derrick's face is clipping before this because his face is actually reading half a stop over our middle gray. And I can refer back to our scene readings that even at middle gray, Derrick's face was reading half a stop over middle gray. So he was actually reading at an n plus half. Let's go back to our n plus 6. And immediately, when we hit 6 stops over middle gray, we start basically losing highlight detail. And 6.5, it's completely gone at 6.5, but plus 6, there's a little bit. So again, between these two and these two, I would say plus 6 is definitely more usable than plus 6.5, but I wouldn't say 6.5 is completely useless. And typically, I'm a little bit more conservative in how I expose to most because I opt for more control in exposure of my image. I don't want to rely on an editor or a colorist that I won't be able to supervise and in treating my footage the way I want to. So I try to more or less tightly control how I expose things just to maintain my authorship of the image. So again, on a conservative level, I would say plus 6 is pretty good. I would probably realistically let it go half a stop over at 6.5 stops, and I would say I wouldn't really want to expose higher than this. And again, let's go back to our 7. Things are gone. It's gone. So now let's go back to our chart. I would say, yeah, I'll give it the benefit of the doubt and say I can kind of use 6.5 stops over. If it's a window that's 6.5 stops over and I want to see maybe some very slight curtain detail, I could say that's within manageable range. Not ideal, but if you're in a pinch, it'll hold and it won't look terrible. So now let's go back to our middle gray. At our N, I expect -6.5 to be pretty good. Let's go here, -0.5, you know, -1, -1.5. I actually bumped the tripod here, so -2, -3. You're actually starting to see some noise in his face, in Derrick's face. So at 3 stops under, you know, we get a little bit of noise. So typically you want to make sure that if there's something very valuable, maybe you're doing a close-up of an actress, you probably don't want to expose her face 3 stops under unless the scene really calls for it. Because again, you start seeing some noise. So -3.5, you still see quite a bit. Let me full screen it. -4, you can still see difference of, you know, detail. 4.5, things are starting to look a little muddy, but completely usable. And, you know, we'll even try to bring stuff up. Let's bring up maybe just, I don't know, let's just bring up something. I think this is totally within acceptable range of recovery for the shadows. So, before, after, completely usable. Even 4.5 stops under. We'll go 5, 6, or sorry, 5.5, sorry. You're starting to lose detail on his face, but again, let's see what we can bring up and if it's too noisy to use or what. Yeah, it still doesn't look completely terrible. There's some detail. I would say, you know, if you have something that's about 5.5 stops over and you want to recover a little bit of detail in that shadow, it's completely workable. -6. You know, it's kind of the same thing, same deal. We'll just bring stuff up and see if it's too noisy to use. And again, this is at our native ISO of 800, or what I would call the native ISO. I'm going to be doing a whole different video on ISO performance and how this test can be used to look at the noise between the different ISOs and how it shifts the dynamic range. And -6.5, I have the previous correction on, or off, where I'll turn it back on. You know, there's a little bit of detail that you can see in his eyebrow and eye area. I wouldn't say it's significant detail, but it's not nothing. So I would say probably about -6.5 is about as low as I would really want to put anything really. Unless it's something that you completely don't want to see any detail. And this is our -7, where again, even if we try to recover something, it doesn't really yield anything useful. Again, his face is completely gone. Let's see if we keep bringing it up. Yeah, we said about -6.5 is where I personally would want to underexpose anything, and +6.5 is the high range. So 13 stops of usable latitude for me. Now you might have uses for it under. Again, you might be shooting something very dark and you kind of want it to have that gritty look, or even have something as low as -7 or -6.5 to create an effect and create a look. And that's totally within your ability and within the realm of possibility with this camera. So I would place the Komodo's latitude between -6.5 to +6.5. Oh, 6.5. And that's 13 stops. That's pretty good. For a global shutter, that's actually very impressive of a camera of this size. So I hope that helped. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, or let me know if you think of it differently. I'd love to hear from you, and we'll see you in the next video where I'll be going over ISO performance and how ISO really changes the image for the Komodo. Thanks.